We have a debate going on right now in the YouTube comments about whether people looking to leave the US, Canada, and Western Europe should go to Latin America or Southeast Asia. We've looked extensively into both regions, and for now we've picked Latin America, but we're super excited to check out Southeast Asia at some point in the near future.
In this video, we are going to be sharing our analysis of both regions with pros and cons lists for each. Now, please note that we're talking about 40 plus different countries here, so we're going to have to do some generalizing. There's also quite a lot of nuance. So for example, in both regions, you will find countries that are more safe than others. Speaking of nuance, finding the right place to relocate to is actually a very nuanced topic. There is no one size fits all when you're looking to relocate to another country, and we can help you decide which region makes the most sense for you. All you need to do is book a consultation call. Go to entrepreneurexpat.com/consult, and we can help you start making sense of all of this based on what your particular needs are.
So let's get into it. Here are some of the pros of Latin America. Now, one of my favorite pros, being an aficionado of getting second residencies and second citizenships, I'm actually looking at another two as well right now outside of Mexico. But in Latin America, it is much easier and a less expensive process. And by expensive, we mean both in fees and also in terms of the financial requirements compared to Southeast Asia. One of the main reasons for that is because Latin America, Mexico in particular, tends to look at more of your income instead of your assets. So while in Southeast Asia, you might be required to show a significant amount of money in the bank or in your investments, in Mexico, as long as you're showing the government that you have enough money to support yourself and to contribute, you're pretty much okay.
Along those same lines, another pro of Latin America is that you can actually become a naturalized citizen in Latin America and collect a passport. Now in Asia, unless you're going to Cambodia, which it does have a citizenship program in Cambodia, it's nearly impossible to become a citizen of an Asian country. So Asia might be better for as a place to live or maybe a long-term residency, although even the long-term residencies are a little iffy, right, in terms of how they work and how much money is needed and the renewals and all that kind of stuff. In comparison to Latin America, typically you'll get a temporary residency, then you'll get your permanent, then you become a naturalized citizen. In Mexico, there are ways to speed up that process. We can do another video on that, on how you can qualify for citizenship in 2 years in Mexico instead of 5. If you would like that, let us know in the comments below. But the point here being that in Latin America, you can collect a passport and some pretty decent passports too. Mexico is a pretty decent passport. So is Argentina.
You can go to Russia on a Mexican passport without a visa.
You can,
and
right?
I think Japan as well.
Japan without a visa. I'm not sure about China, but at least Russia and Japan, you can go without a visa or like visa on entry or something like that. So Mexico is actually a pretty good and decent passport in a lot of ways. Some people in this expat space actually say it's probably one of the top passports in the world based on their qualifications.
And it's growing. A lot of the Latin American passports, whether that's Mexico, El Salvador, other countries, if they're not already, they're going to start to get much higher up in the rankings.
Colombia's gone higher up in the rankings. Yeah, things like that. So if you're interested in a second citizenship, that's obviously a lot easier to do in Latin America. It's damn near impossible in Southeast Asia.
Another pro of Latin America is that Spanish is a lot easier to learn. Some of you may have even already learned it in high school or from your parents if you've got Latin origins, or perhaps you've studied it later on in life, or you've traveled to Latin America. You probably know that Spanish is not super difficult of a language to learn. I became pretty fluent in about 2 to 3 years while living in Colombia. And if you're just trying to learn conversational Spanish, you can realistically do that in about 6 or 7 months from my experience, especially when you're immersing yourself in another country, versus if you're in Southeast Asia and you're trying to learn Thai or Vietnamese, you're typically dealing with accent characters or perhaps an entirely different alphabet that you would need to learn in addition to the spoken language. So with Spanish, you don't have to struggle as much. And the other cool thing about Spanish is that it's so widely spoken across the region. Other than a few countries in South America, Spanish is pretty much the de facto language. So you learn that once and you can live anywhere in Latin America.
And even if you go to Brazil where they speak Portuguese, you can get by with Spanish pretty easily in Brazil. So it does open you up to a lot of countries to learn Spanish, and it's much easier to learn. Okay, next one. This is super important for those of you who run businesses. This comes up all the time, and this is probably one of our deciding factors. Same time zones in Latin America as the US, and not super crazy time zones for Europe. So for those of you who have businesses and most of your clients are American or Canadian or European, or you need to be like on those hours-ish, then Latin America is a lot easier. One of the issues we have with Southeast Asia is like, okay, well, if we're doing calls for a business, we're doing calls at like 1 a.m. Nobody wants to do that. Now, that being said, we do have a business plan for Entrepreneur Expat where, for example, and YouTube is a big part of that, where we can build in more passive income so we wouldn't have to be doing calls at 1 o'clock in the morning when we decide to go to Southeast Asia. But, that's a part of the plan, and we're in process for that. But that's definitely a pro of Latin America, is same time zones if you need those for business purposes.
Another thing that expats love about Latin America is that there are super easy flights back home for business or family reasons. Now, if you're traveling back, let's say from Thailand, you might be on a plane for 12 hours or even almost an entire day if you've got connecting flights, depending on where in the US it is you're trying to come back to, versus from Mexico, from here to Miami or here to LA, it's only about a 2 to 3 hour flight either way. Pretty accessible. There's also a ton of direct flights. You can fly to those places as well as Dallas, Chicago, New York, and probably about another 5 or 6 different cities from Guadalajara nonstop most days of the week. Versus if you're in Asia, you're almost always going to have to connect, unless maybe you're going from a major hub, perhaps Bangkok to LA. You could fly direct. There's other routes to different countries depending on how big the country is and where in the US you're going. If you're on the West Coast, you're more likely, if you're trying to fly to the West Coast, you're more likely to get a nonstop flight from Asia, but it's still going to be expensive and it's still going to be a really long flight.
Next is food quality in Latin America is excellent. Now, we have heard that food quality in Southeast Asia is better than the United States, but that's not
saying much.
Yeah, that's not saying a whole lot. And we have heard that the food quality in Latin America tends to be better than in Asia. However, there is an area of food where Asia far surpasses Latin America, but you'll have to keep watching this video to find out what that is.
And another thing that's cool about Latin America, if you really like to have nice weather, especially if you're coming from one of the colder places in North America, is that you can pretty much always find good weather and different climates to suit your preference. So when people think of Mexico, traditionally, you might think that it's desert and there's those tumbleweeds on the ground, or just beaches or jungle. But the reality is there are places in Mexico that actually have snow. I don't know if they're really known for their ski resorts, but you can definitely find snow, colder climates, warmer climates depending on the city you're in, depending on the elevation and things like that. So you can find things all the way from, let's say, the East Caribbean coast, where it can get as high as 100 degrees or more in the summer and super humid, to, when you're near the beach, to mountain climates where it's a lot more temperate, like many places in the US, and even all the way up to snowing in the mountains, depending on how high up you get and the season. So there definitely can be seasons here depending on where you are. Here in Guadalajara, it's pretty much temperate, nice weather all year round, a little on the warmer sunny side, but we like that.
Next, and this is a big one that a lot of you are concerned about, in Latin America, foreigners can own property depending on where it is, but foreigners can own property in Latin America. So if you're looking into real estate investments and things like that, it's going to be a little easier for you in Latin America.
And there's also excellent private healthcare here in Latin America, and it's a lot cheaper than it is in the US. Doctors tend to be more accessible, spend a lot of time with you. It's not just you're rushed in and out in 15 minutes. There's really good quality private healthcare in all the major cities, and pretty solid healthcare even in the towns as well.
Yeah, Mexico alone makes up about 40% of the world's health and dental tourism. I'm willing to bet Thailand makes up the other portion of it, or Malaysia or something like that. So in fairness, both regions are known for having excellent private healthcare.
And in Latin America, there are large communities of foreigners, especially expats from your country, like from the US or Canada, just about wherever you go, whether that's Mexico City, Guadalajara, Lake Chapala, and some of the towns around there, like Ajijic. There's tons of expat communities pretty much all over. That can be a pro or a con, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But you're definitely not going to find any shortage of Americans here.
Now, the cons of Latin America, because it's not all flowers and rainbows and glitter anywhere in the world. So the cons of Latin America: total lack of efficiency for anything administrative, particularly if it's personal administrative
Getting your
things.
passport, a driver's license, a bank account open, trying to get your tax ID from the tax authorities, going to immigration. You're spending hours or days completing those kinds of things. And fortunately, you don't necessarily have to do those sorts of things all the time, but it is something to.
You also don't have to do them alone, particularly in Mexico. You can have not even attorneys. You could also have facilitators who don't have to be attorneys in Mexico. We can connect you with many of those. So if you're interested in that, make sure to book that consultation below.
Another thing is some countries like Costa Rica, Panama, and Ecuador are actually quite expensive. In some cases, even as expensive, depending on where you are, as some cities in the US. Mexico and Colombia are a little less expensive, but more expensive than Southeast Asia by about double or more if you're comparing it to countries like Vietnam. So while you can save a little bit of money in Latin America, it might not be as much as you think, and not as much as you'd save in many places in Southeast Asia.
Next one is maybe a deal breaker for some of you, which is Latin America is not as tax friendly as Southeast Asia. In fact, it can be a tax hell in Latin America if you don't know what you're doing. Again, we have vetted accountants in multiple countries as well as in the United States who work with expats that we can connect you to. So book that consult if you are looking for them.
Absolutely. And one thing that we hear a lot as well is safety. So safety is not nearly as bad, in our opinion, in Mexico or many other countries in Latin America as it is in the US media as far as how they portray it here. It's actually a lot safer than the media in the US makes it out to be, because they're focusing on hotspots that do have a lot of gang violence or crimes, and that's not representative of all of Mexico or all of Latin America. And most expats are not going to go to the areas that they talk about in the US news. But it's not as safe as Southeast Asia for sure, even though it's much safer than a lot of places we've been to in the US. And that's one of the things that we like about it is there is good safety here in Mexico. And you don't have to deal with things like random violence as much as you would in the United States. But it's not quite as safe as Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia tends to be very, very safe.
Okay, so speaking of which, now let's go into the pros of Southeast Asia. We already talked about one of them, which is safety, but here are some others that we are adding to the list that we haven't really talked about yet.
So as we mentioned in the previous list about the cons of Latin America, this is a pro of Southeast Asia, which is there's a much lower cost of living compared to Latin America. So in countries like Vietnam, you can rent an apartment in a nice touristy area not that far from the beach for $300 or $400 per month. Maybe by the time that you watch this video, that's not going to be true anymore, because a lot of those countries are growing so rapidly and increasing tourism and offering plans for foreign investment that weren't available in those countries before. But as of today, you're going to save a lot of money living in Vietnam, living in even Thailand, Cambodia, so many other places versus, or maybe Bali, Indonesia, versus living in Latin America. Because Latin America is so close in proximity to the US and Canada, they have been getting more and more tourism over the years, as well as more expats because of their proximity and also because of the expat-friendly immigration regulations that they've had.
Next is safety. Southeast Asia and Asia in general is known for being pretty safe, definitely in comparison to Latin America, although as always, there are some countries that are safer than others.
Now, one pro, and I'm a big fan of this, of Southeast Asia is the Asian food. Now, you don't necessarily go to Bangkok to order pad thai. That's really a dish that was created to appeal to the slightly less spicy loving American palate. But you talk about curries, you talk about a lot of the other traditional dishes, the pho in Vietnam, and so many of the other things that they have that, I mean, I love Asian food. I got a pretty good taste of it in the Bay Area and in LA in California, but there's nothing like being in Asia. And that's why we're looking forward to visiting in the next year or two because we're big foodies. We love the food in Latin America, but you really cannot find good Asian food here, unfortunately.
That might be changing a little bit in Mexico because there are a lot of people from Asia moving to Mexico, but it hasn't quite hit yet. So we still haven't found really good Asian food anywhere in Latin America. So definitely a con. We do miss the Asian food.
Another pro of Southeast Asia is the better banking. Here in Mexico, it's difficult to open a bank account, especially for foreigners. You don't have very good customer service. You don't have very good protection of your money in a lot of cases either. Like they don't have the same type of debit card protection, let's say, as you would in the US, versus Southeast Asia tends to have a lot more consumer protections in the banking space. They make it easier to bank. They're more friendly.
And Asia, Singapore specifically, has like the best banks in the whole world. They're known for being the safest banks in the whole world. So generally speaking, that region does tend to have better banking options, at least definitely like the Singapores and the Malaysias and stuff like that.
And we also have heard that the infrastructure in Southeast Asia, on an average basis, is much better than that in Latin America. Now, I've lived all throughout Latin America, including in Colombia, and I visited Panama as well, and kind of just been all over the place here. And it's gotten better over the last decade for sure, but especially in small towns, it tends to be a little hit or miss in terms of if you're going to be able to get really, really solid infrastructure. Now, you can always use things like Starlink as a backup, but when we're talking about the average internet, I'll give you one example, and this doesn't even have to do with the infrastructure per se. It almost has more to do with the culture in terms of people working remotely and things like that. But when you go to a random cafe, even in Guadalajara, they just don't have their shit together as far as the Wi-Fi. Like, even though they might have a good ISP, they don't think about putting multiple hotspots and things like that. I would say that from what we've heard, especially in tourist areas like Bali or like Bangkok, they tend to think more about your experience as far as the infrastructure, making sure you've got a good Wi-Fi connection at a cafe and things like that. Southeast Asia does tend to have better infrastructure overall.
Another thing Asia is known for is better housing. Now, that does not mean that the housing in Latin America is awful. Sometimes people will hear about Asia or Latin America or Africa. Africa, they think people live in mud huts, which is not true. In Latin America, they think people live, I don't know, with like banana leaves on their roof or something. I have no idea. We will get wild comments. And in Asia, they also think they live in huts sometimes. Like, that is not true in any of these regions. But what we do mean by better housing is that in Southeast Asia, you're definitely going to find a lot more modern. You're going to find a lot more luxury in Southeast Asia. It is changing, at least from what we're seeing here in Mexico. I mean, there's new buildings going up all the time, and they are focusing on more modern and more luxury in a lot of these buildings. But, you know, Southeast Asia is famous for being able to have a luxurious lifestyle and housing.
All the high rises and nice views of the ocean and all that. It's not as common here. Here, it's a little bit more traditional infrastructure. The houses are probably older on average, at least here in Mexico. I think our house is about 50 or 60 years old.
Yeah. Next is excellent private healthcare in Southeast Asia. Thailand is famous for it. Malaysia is famous for it. So in that sense, they're kind of on par in terms of healthcare. There are areas in Southeast Asia that are famous for their healthcare. There's areas in Latin America, like Mexico, that are famous for their healthcare. So in that case, it's a draw. They both have good healthcare. And they both also have large communities of foreigners, digital nomads, international crowd. Both regions of the world tend to have that because both regions of the world are, very well known to expats and global citizens.
Now let's talk about some of the cons of Southeast Asia. So number one, it tends to be a little bit more difficult to integrate into the culture. Now, of course, here in Mexico, Amanda has a little bit more of a of an added benefit than I do in the fact that she is Latina and her family is from Cuba. And so there's a lot more in common in terms of the culture, let's say, than me being American and Ukrainian being in Mexico. But even with that said, I've found it, especially with learning the language and talking to people in the local language, it's just been a lot easier to integrate into the local culture, make friends. They tend to also have much more similar cultures in Latin America than they do in Asia.
It's less of a culture shock.
It's less of a culture shock, and that's why they say that Latin America might be a little bit more of a soft landing than Southeast Asia might be. So it's more difficult to integrate in Southeast Asia, and it's uh, related to that. The languages are a lot harder to learn. Like we mentioned, the pros of Latin America, Spanish is a lot easier to learn than many of the languages, and it's also much more widely spoken and universal. Versus you go to Southeast Asia, and you're talking about so many different languages across Asia. You've got Chinese, you've got Japanese, and then going specifically to Southeast Asia, you've got Thai, you've got Viet in Vietnam, and Indonesian, right? You've got all of these different languages. So unless you're planning on spending a bunch of time in a single country and learning that language for a number of years, which some people might not want to do if they can't get those extended residencies right away. Like, why are you going to go to a country that you may only be able to stay in for 90 days at a time and invest the time in learning the local language to then have to go and move and travel somewhere else? So that's another con, is that the languages are much more difficult to learn.
We talked about this one, time zones, totally opposite in Southeast Asia. So if you have to be like on American or European business hours, Southeast Asia is basically out of the question because you're going to be on like this totally reverse schedule. That's going to make it pretty difficult. We also mentioned qualifying for residency often requires a lot more money. And it's also not usually like a permanent residency. Like Malaysia, you can get a permanent residency by buying real estate and depositing money in a bank account. But for example, with Thailand, it's almost like a membership program, the way that the residency works. And then you keep renewing it every few years. Vietnam doesn't even have a residency program, but they are making some changes to that. We did a video about that recently. Whereas in Latin America, it's pretty straightforward. It's like, do you have money? Some countries will ask for a background check. Maybe put a little bit of money in a bank and you're done. And you can turn that temporary into a permanent, the permanent into a citizenship.
So like Amanda mentioned, it's very difficult to get citizenship. But in addition to that, if you're looking to buy property in Mexico and other countries in Latin America, it's quite easy. Foreigners generally can own property with some exceptions. But in Southeast Asia, best case scenario, you're talking about a long-term lease. Even if you quote unquote buy the property, you're not generally owning the land under the property, and you have a lease that you have to renew subject to certain conditions. They're doing that because they're trying to keep most of the property in the hands of locals, which makes sense, but it does make our lives as expats a little bit more difficult. In certain countries like Malaysia, they are giving you long-term residence if you buy property and allowing foreigners to own property outright. But that's really more of the exception rather than the rule.
Okay, next con of Southeast Asia. For some of you, again, this is a deal breaker depending on what's going on. Very long haul flights to get to and from United States, Canada, and Europe. I mean, we're talking, I've seen some people traveling for 24 hours straight.
Yeah, if you've got connections and layover time, absolutely, it can get tricky.
And the final one, which could be a pro or a con depending on the person, is that Southeast Asia tends to just be hot and humid throughout all of Southeast Asia. There are some places like perhaps maybe Chiang Mai in Thailand, which is a little cooler, or Hanoi in Vietnam is also a little bit cooler. But generally speaking, you're looking at hot and humid. And even in the cooler places, you might be looking at more extreme summers and things like that. That could be a pro or a con depending on the person. I mean, if you like humidity, they say it's really good for your skin and it keeps you looking young. And again, it could depend on health issues and things like that, which actually, I forgot to add this as a con to Southeast Asia, which could also be a problem in Latin America. But in Latin America, you have more options. There's a lot more air pollution.
Especially in the big cities.
In Southeast Asia.
It's really, really bad.
Yeah, like it's kind of bad in Mexico. Like Mexico City is horrible for air pollution. Guadalajara is not great, but Guadalajara still ranks higher than a lot of cities in Southeast Asia. And again, in Latin America, you have a lot more options in terms of cities. and some aren't going to be as bad with the air pollution as others. But in Southeast Asia, the air pollution, the burn season, all that stuff tends to be really horrendous. So for those of you who perhaps have asthma or some sort of health concern where air pollution is a problem, you can forget the cities in Southeast Asia. Maybe you're looking more at like islands and things like that, but that is a con that I forgot to put on this list.
Both regions, as you've heard, have their own pros and cons. And obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. And I'm sure a lot of you will say, hey, but this country doesn't fit into the mold of what you've said. And absolutely, this doesn't apply 100% across the board. We're totally generalizing here. If you've got any feedback or maybe any outliers, feel free to share those in the comments. Like, hey, I think that this country actually doesn't necessarily follow that thing that you said. We'd love to hear about it because we're always looking to learn more about those different countries in these two regions. So based on the list, which one would you pick? Let us know in the comments which one you like better and why. Does Mexico and Latin America perhaps win, or do countries like Vietnam and Thailand in Southeast Asia seem to tickle your fancy a little bit more? Just let us know. And if you haven't already subscribed, what are you waiting for? We post some of the best content out there for expats, specifically entrepreneur expats like yourself. So make sure you subscribe. Don't miss a video. Hit that notification bell and like this video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment down below. And if you're interested,
Finally, if you need help in choosing the best place for you, or maybe you're looking for real estate, business opportunities in other countries and things like that, make sure to book a moving abroad consult. Just go to entrepreneurexpat.com/consult. There's an application there so we can kind of get a gist of what your particular situation is, and then we can start making game plans from there.
thanks for watching. See you next time.